All right, so are you ready? Buckle up, because we are diving deep today into something that's, well, I've got some people shouting from the rooftops and others just shaking their heads,
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Homeopathy.
Homeopathy, yep.
That's what we're talking about today. And you shared some fascinating sources with us, listeners. Did you know about this? And we're going to try to unpack some of the claims that are made and most importantly, look at what the science actually says.
Yeah.
We've got a YouTube video, and it features Marc Henry, a French scientist, and he makes some pretty bold arguments.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, and he even talks about a project in Bangladesh where over 1 million people were treated for arsenic poisoning using homeopathy.
Wow.
Yeah, it sounds wild, right?
It does.
But hold on, because our mission here is not to prove or disprove homeopathy,
Right.
but to understand the arguments that are being made and to see if they, if they hold water.
Pun intended.
Pun very much intended.
Okay.
So, let's start with Marc Henry himself. He's a member of the French Academy of Medicine.
Oh, wow. So he's
got
legit.
He's got some serious scientific credentials.
Definitely.
Okay, so here's the big idea that he is putting forward. Water has memory.
Okay.
He's suggesting that water can store information even when it's diluted to the point where none of the original substance is left.
Like the old saying, you can take the substance out of the water, but the water never forgets.
Huh. Exactly. And this memory is supposedly what homeopathic remedies are based on.
Okay.
Pretty radical idea, right?
It really challenges how we conventionally understand chemistry.
For sure.
Like we're taught the more you dilute something, the weaker it gets, but he's saying the opposite.
Right.
That dilution actually increases the information content of the water.
Now, I don't know about you, but my brain needs a little bit more convincing here.
Oh, sure.
So let's look at the experiments that he uses to back up his claims.
Sure.
He starts off with a study by Professor Luc Montagnier, and you might recognize that name because
I do.
he's a Nobel laureate. He co-discovered the HIV virus.
Right.
Now, Montagnier was looking at Lyme disease.
Okay, for our listener who might not be familiar, Lyme disease is a bacterial infection, and it can cause a whole bunch of long-term health problems.
Right.
Yeah.
So in this experiment, they took DNA from Lyme disease patients, and they diluted it. And I mean really diluted it.
Wow.
We're talking way beyond what conventional science says is possible for any original molecules to remain.
So they were creating solutions that were similar to the ultra-diluted remedies that are used in homeopathy.
Exactly. And then they use these super diluted solutions in a process called PCR. And do you want to explain what PCR is all about for our listener?
Sure. PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction.
Okay.
And it's basically like a molecular photocopier for DNA.
Okay.
So you take a teeny bit of DNA, and then PCR makes millions of copies of it.
Oh, wow.
And it's a really important tool that's used in all sorts of things, from medical diagnostics to forensic science.
So you need actual DNA for PCR to work right.
That's the conventional understanding, yes.
Well, here's where it gets interesting and maybe a little controversial.
Okay.
The PCR still worked, even with these insanely diluted solutions.
Really?
So if this is true, you're telling me a drop of a substance diluted in an entire ocean could still have an effect.
That's a huge claim.
That's huge.
Yeah.
And it is a remarkable claim, and if we assume for a moment that the experiment was conducted flawlessly, it does suggest that the water somehow retained information about the original DNA.
Right, even though no actual DNA molecules should have been present.
It's like the water was remembering the DNA's blueprint
Yeah.
and passing that information on to the PCR process.
That's interesting.
I know it sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, right?
It does.
Now, this experiment has been criticized by some scientists, and it's not universally accepted.
Right.
But it definitely makes you think, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It raises questions about our current understanding of how information might be stored and transmitted, not just in water, but potentially in other systems as well.
Okay, so that's one experiment, but Henry doesn't stop there.
Oh, there's more?
He goes on to describe another study, this one by Dr. Albert Claude Kiemon, who was researching mouse brains.
Okay, mouse brains, I'm intrigued. What were they looking at?
So they took these receptors in the mouse brains and blocked them with a radioactive substance.
Okay.
Then they administered another molecule diluted homeopathically, again, way beyond what should be possible for any of the original molecule to remain.
Oh, wow.
And guess what?
I'm on the edge of my seat here. What happened?
At those incredibly high dilutions, the blocking substance was displaced.
Really?
It's like a ghost of the original molecule was still interacting with the brain receptors.
That is a remarkable finding, if true.
Yeah.
It would suggest that even without any physical molecules present, the diluted substance was somehow having an effect.
Right.
It seems to support Henry's idea that the information, not the substance itself, is key.
Okay, so now we're getting into the heart of Henry's model of water memory. This is where things get a bit complex, but bear with us.
Okay.
He says it all comes down to how water molecules, photons, and something called vacuum fluctuations interact to create these things called domains of coherence, which can store information.
All right, let me try to break this down for our listener. We all know what water molecules are good old H2O,
Right.
and photons are particles of light.
Yeah.
But vacuum fluctuations, that's where things get a little mind-bending.
Right.
It's a concept from quantum physics that basically says even in a perfect vacuum, there's this constant buzz of energy and particles popping in and out of existence.
Okay, my brain is doing backflips trying to understand this. Let's take a breather.
Okay,
And use a simpler example.
okay,
Imagine a still pond.
okay,
It looks peaceful on the surface, right?
right.
But underneath, there's a whole world of activity.
Fish swimming, plants growing.
Currents moving.
Exactly.
That's kind of like what's happening at the quantum level.
That's a really good analogy.
So even though we think of a vacuum as empty, it's actually teeming with potential energy and particles that are constantly appearing and disappearing?
Yeah.
Got it. So how do these vacuum fluctuations tie into water memory?
Well, Henry's theory is that these vacuum fluctuations, along with photons and water molecules, create these domains of coherence, little pockets within the water that can somehow hold and transmit information.
Oh, okay.
So think of these domains of coherence like tiny bubbles in the water,
Okay.
each holding a piece of information from the original substance.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture, but here's the part that still blows my mind. Henry claims that by diluting a substance, you're actually increasing the number of these domains of coherence
Wow.
and spreading that information throughout the water.
A mind-bending concept, for sure.
Yeah.
It goes against our everyday experience.
For sure.
But that's the essence of his argument. It's not about the number of molecules present. It's about the information that's been imprinted onto the water itself.
So it's like recording a song onto a cassette tape. You can copy that tape over and over again.
Right.
And even though the original recording is gone, the information, the song is still there on those copies.
That's a clever analogy.
But does it hold up scientifically?
Right.
How exactly would information be transferred from these domains to the body cells?
Yeah,
These are questions that require further investigation and scientific rigor.
for sure.
Okay, so we've talked about two pretty wild experiments and this intricate model of water memory, but does Henry offer any real-world examples of how these ideas can be applied?
I'm curious.
Well, remember that arsenic detox project we mentioned earlier?
Yeah.
That's where things get even more interesting. Let's dive into that next.
Okay. Speaking of mind-blowing, let's shift gears to that arsenic project in Bangladesh. You mentioned it involved over 1 million people. That's a massive scale.
It is, and it gets right to the heart of whether Henry's ideas have real-world applications. So, as you might know, Bangladesh has a huge problem with arsenic contamination in its groundwater.
Right. Yep.
It's a serious health crisis, and conventional treatments can be expensive and difficult to implement.
Right. Arsenic poisoning is a slow, insidious killer. It can cause all sorts of health problems from skin lesions to cancer.
Yeah,
So if there was a safe and effective way to treat it using homeopathy, that would be a game changer.
exactly. So in this project, Henry and his team used homeopathic dilutions of arsenic to treat people who had been exposed to high levels of arsenic in their drinking water.
Okay, now this is where I get a bit skeptical treating arsenic poisoning with more arsenic, even in a diluted form. It sounds counterintuitive to say the least.
I hear you. It definitely goes against everything we're taught about toxins, but remember, in homeopathy, the idea is that like cures.
Oh, right, right.
So by introducing a tiny amount of substance that causes similar symptoms to the illness, you're supposedly stimulating the body's natural healing response.
Right, the whole law of similar principle.
Yeah.
But still, it's hard to wrap my head around how a diluted substance, especially one as toxic as arsenic, could actually have a beneficial effect.
Well, according to Henry, the results of this project were pretty dramatic. He claims that over 1 million people were treated, and urine tests showed significant increases in arsenic elimination after they took the homeopathic remedies.
1 million people is a huge sample size, I'll give him that. But was this a controlled scientific study? Were there control groups who didn't receive the homeopathic treatment?
That's where things get a little murky. It seems like it was more of a large-scale intervention or a public health initiative rather than a rigorously controlled clinical trial.
That makes it much harder to draw any firm conclusions about the effectiveness of the treatment. You'd want to rule out other factors that might have contributed to the arsenic reduction, like changes in diet or water sources.
I agree it would be great to see more controlled studies to really understand what happened, but even if we set the arsenic project aside, the other experiments we talked about, along with Henry's model of water memory, are pretty mind-boggling, wouldn't you say?
They are fascinating. I'll grant you that they definitely challenge our conventional understanding of how substances work.
So let's imagine for a moment that Henry's model of water memory is accurate. What would that mean for our understanding of biology and medicine?
Well, for starters, it would mean that the information contained within a substance is just as important as the substance itself.
So it's not just about the physical molecules, it's about the energetic blueprint those molecules carry.
Exactly. And if that information can be transferred to water, then water becomes a carrier of sorts, almost like a blueprint for the body to follow.
That's a pretty radical departure from how we currently view the body. It suggests that there's this whole other layer of communication happening at a level we're just beginning to understand.
It would mean that we need to expand our scientific models to include these more subtle energetic influences. It's like we've been looking at the world through a very narrow lens, and now someone's handed us a wider lens that reveals a whole new landscape, and it's exciting, but also a bit daunting.
I can see how it would be. So if water really can store and transmit information, like Henry suggests, how might that actually work within the body? Like, how would a homeopathic remedy, even one that's been diluted to the point of practically no original substance remaining, actually do anything?
Well, remember that our bodies are mostly water, about 70% in fact.
Right, we're basically walking water balloons.
Ah, pretty much so. According to Henry's model, when you take a homeopathic remedy, those informed water molecules from the remedy interact with the water in your body, and those domains of coherence, those little bubbles of information we talked about earlier, would start transmitting their message.
And this is where the whole, like, cures, like, principle of homeopathy comes in.
Exactly. In conventional medicine, it sounds crazy to treat a fever with something that would cause a fever, right? But in homeopathy, the idea is that by introducing a similar frequency or pattern of information, you're nudging the body's own self-regulating mechanisms back in the balance.
So it's less about fighting the illness directly and more about giving the body the information it needs to heal itself.
That's the general idea. It's a much more subtle approach than conventional medicine.
Okay, so this is all pretty mind-blowing stuff, but we've got to address the elephant in the room, the skeptics. There are a lot of people, especially in the scientific community, who dismiss homeopathy as quackery or a placebo effect. How does Henry respond to those criticisms?
He doesn't shy away from the criticism. In fact, he acknowledges that there's been a lot of poorly conducted research on homeopathy, which hasn't helped its reputation.
So he's not saying that all homeopathy is good homeopathy.
Exactly. He's very critical of some of the more commercialized aspects of homeopathy and emphasizes the need for rigorous scientific studies to validate its claims.
He's also calling for a more open-minded approach within the scientific community, right? He's basically saying that the current scientific paradigm is too limited to fully grasp these phenomena.
He is, and that's a point that often gets lost in the debate. Science is supposed to be about questioning, exploring, and being open to new possibilities.
But sometimes it feels like the scientific community could be pretty resistant to anything that challenges the status quo.
There's definitely a tendency to stick to the familiar and to dismiss anything that doesn't fit into the prevailing paradigm.
So where do we go from here? I mean, we've discussed some pretty wild concepts. We've talked about water having memory information being more important than the substance itself, and a potential arsenic detox project that sounds almost too good to be true. What are the key takeaways for our listener who's been on this journey with us?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's still much we don't know about the nature of reality, especially when it comes to water and its role in biological systems.
It's almost like water is one of the last great frontiers of scientific exploration. We think we know it so well, but Henry's model suggests there might be a lot more to water than meets the eye.
Exactly. And while Henry's model of water memory is intriguing, it's important to remember that it's still a theory and it needs more rigorous scientific evidence to back it up.
Right, we shouldn't jump to conclusions based on a few intriguing experiments.
Exactly. But what's so exciting about this deep dive is that it opens up a world of possibilities. It challenges us to think differently about the world and about our place in it.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder if we're just scratching the surface, when it comes to healing in the human body.
I think that's a great point. We tend to focus so much on the physical aspects of health,
Right,
but what if there's this whole other dimension of energetic information that plays a role?
right. It's like we're looking at the hardware of the body,
Yeah.
but forgetting about the software.
The information that runs the whole show.
Exactly.
That's a great analogy.
And if water is this carrier of information, as Henry suggests,
Yeah.
it would make sense that it could have such profound effects on our well-being.
It would, and it would also explain why so many cultures throughout history have viewed water as sacred and healing.
Oh, that's a good point.
Think about all the rituals and traditions involving water,
Right.
baptisms, cleansing ceremonies, even just taking a relaxing bath.
Yeah.
Maybe our ancestors intuitively understood something about the power of water that we're only now beginning to rediscover.
Okay, so we've talked about water memory, homeopathy, and some pretty wild experiments, but I'm curious, from your perspective, what are the most compelling pieces of evidence that Henry presents? What really stood out to you?
Honestly, what I find most intriguing is how he connects his model of water memory to the bigger picture, of how we understand the universe.
Right.
He's not just talking about molecules and dilutions, he's talking about a fundamental shift in our worldview.
That's what makes his deep dive so fascinating. It's not just about homeopathy.
Right.
It's about questioning our assumptions about the very nature of reality.
Exactly, and it raises some really big questions.
Yeah.
If water can truly store and transmit information, what are the implications for how we view consciousness intention, even the interconnectedness of all things?
Okay, now we're getting into some really deep waters.
Haha, we are, but this is where it gets really exciting because Henry's model suggests that information might be just as fundamental as matter and energy.
So it's not just about the physical stuff. It's
Right.
about the information that underlies and connects everything.
That's right. And if information is that fundamental, it could mean that we're all interconnected in ways we never even imagined.
It's like we're all swimming in this sea of information, and
Yeah,
water is the medium that connects us all.
that's a beautiful way to put it. And it opens up a whole new way of thinking about healing, not just as fixing a broken part, but as restoring balance to the flow of information within and around us.
You know what's really cool is that there's a growing body of research on the effects of intention and consciousness on water. Have you seen those studies where people send positive thoughts to water and it changes the structure of the water crystals?
I have, and while more research is certainly needed in that area, those findings are fascinating. They suggest that our thoughts and intentions might have a tangible effect on the world around us, especially on water, which seems so receptive to those subtle influences.
It's like water is a mirror reflecting back to us not just our physical state,
Yeah,
but our emotional and mental states as well.
that's a beautiful way to think about it.
And if we can learn to consciously work with water to imbue it with positive intentions and healing energies,
Yeah.
imagine the possibilities for ourselves and for the planet.
The potential is vast.
Right.
It really underscores the interconnectedness of all things.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored some pretty wild concepts, but hopefully we've given you a taste of the fascinating world of water memory and homeopathy and what it might mean for how we understand health healing and even the nature of reality itself.
It's been a true pleasure diving into this with you.
And to our listener, thanks for coming along for the ride. We encourage you to keep exploring this topic, keep questioning, and keep an open mind. After all, the more we learn, the more we realize how much there still is to discover. Maybe one day we'll look back on this conversation and think, wow, remember when water memory sounded like science fiction? Now look how much our understanding has evolved. Who knows what other incredible breakthroughs await us if we just stay curious and open to the mysteries of the universe. 60, 80 years.